I bought an entire tree's worth of walnut slabs in an attempt to make my dream desk. A whole tree for one desk. My current desk, which I bought 15 years ago at a thrift store for $20, isn't exactly stable. Although I had a good drawing, not having a solid plan for this build wasn't the best way to start. I like buying slabs, but as you can probably tell, not because they have live edges on them, live edges being the organic looking outside of the tree. I like them more because I can make choices. I can print off one-to-one paper templates from my regular old printer by using copious amounts of Scotch tape and choose exactly where on the slabs I can cut out my most important parts for the legs of my desk so that the grain will follow the curves. Did I mention there will be a lot of curves? I'm just gonna go ahead and fast forward through 2 long days of my life rough cutting and milling all the desk parts because it's all just a little bit boring and a lot of it repetitive. The front legs were the only parts that wouldn't fit through my 8-inch jointer, so I had to use this sled that goes through my planer that uses glued down wedges to make sure the planer makes a flat face. I'm sure at the time I was cursing having to do this, partially because I used to own and subsequently got rid of not 1, but 2 different 12-inch jointers in the past. But let me tell you, pushing a 12-inch wide board through a jointer is not fun at all for these twig-like arms. And an 8-inch jointer works 98% of the time for what I do. You don't always need the biggest tool possible. Turning a paper template into a router template is pretty simple to do, which I did for many templates on this build, but sometimes you need more precision than this can offer. Since I haven't been sent, nor have I bought, nor have the room for a CNC machine, I found a friend who has accomplished 2 out of 3 of those things. Some of you may recognize Zach from Zach Builds, who does live in the same city as me, but since we have some of the most delightfully horrendous traffic in North America, it took me an hour to get there and an hour to get back. Next time, I think I'll just sell my soul for a CNC rather than making friends. And Zach also wanted me to tell you that he nailed this first try and that his CNC definitely did not have some random error that caused the parts to collide with each other. Thinking ahead is challenging for me sometimes, but I managed to get my act together here. You see, it's time to make a second, much closer rough cut to my templates so I can powder around the legs and feet as one piece after I glue them together. But how in the heck am I going to clamp these curved pieces together if they're so curved? It's actually pretty easy. Just mark out exactly where I want to put the clamps perpendicularly across the joint and then leave some little triangles or notches after rough cutting for the clamps to sit on. It's so simple, but it's such an easy thing to forget that would have made my life so much harder when it came time to glue it up. I'm using the domino to join the feet to the legs here. Even though I've done a whole series of videos on joints, I don't really get my kicks out of making joinery. This project is an aesthetic design exploration, and joinery isn't really important for aesthetics for me. It's perfectly fine if exposed mortise and tendons and dovetails is your jam, but personally, I've never been super into something like arts and crafts furniture. So the domino makes quick work of joining these together in a strong enough way so I can move on to making other design elements. Now it's almost time to repeat the same steps to join the front leg assembly to the back leg assembly, but I had to go ahead and do a little bit of pattern routing first where I won't be able to reach the router bit once they're glued together. Another good example of how thinking one step ahead of what needs to be done next can save a lot of time and hassle later, but unfortunately for me, I think I should be thinking a few more steps ahead at this point. I may have to redact something I said in the past. Although I can't remember if this is something I said out loud or just in my head, but anyways, I used to discount pattern routing as something that was only useful for making it easy to repeat shapes multiple times, but I fully see now that it's much more than that. Not only is it truly faster than rough cutting a curve and sanding down to a line, but it's also become a whole workflow thing for me. Drawing my designs in SketchUp is a huge part of the process for me, and being able to go from computer to template, even without a CNC, is really advantageous. For some reason, I thought it was a good idea to do some finish prep here, while simultaneously knowing that I should probably have some sort of edge profile here as well. This is a little bit of a hole in my plan that'll come back to bite me later. An edge profile could be something like a roundover, a chamfer, or something more classically inspired like an OG profile, which was definitely a strong contender on this modern looking desk. Just like pattern routing the inside of these legs, it would have been in my best interest to take care of the edge profile here at the same time, but as you can see, I didn't, and I'm gluing this together permanently. Now I can take the clamps off my joyous clamping spots, rough cut them off on the bandsaw, flush it up with a template, and finish sand a surface that doesn't need to be finish sanded because there's no edge profile yet. Now you would think that it'd be a good time to cut the legs to length, and clearly I did too. So after cutting the bottom clamping spots, I used my carefully placed track saw and cut the legs to length. I really hope I'm not putting a decision off for future Scott to figure out. What decision? I don't know, like the edge profile? I carried on obliviously to glue up the main desktop. I wanted the best look possible, so I spent a while trying to figure out what grain I like best, and I even asked the resident corgi what he thought. He told me he wanted the good faces on the bottom, but I think that's just because he's so short. I jointed and planed again since the walnut had been resting, and there's something very interesting about this one video clip right here. And I want you to comment down below when you're finished watching this video if you know why. I edge jointed these boards together by hand because I can't get a perfect edge with my big machine jointer. And before you say my jointer isn't set up correctly, trust me, it is. I'm actually not that experienced with the Festool Domino. When gluing up a regular mortise and tenon, I'm pretty intentional about the amount of glue I use after experiencing a hydrolock joint once. If you don't know, a piston fit mortise and tenon won't go together if there's too much glue because it just gets trapped with nowhere to escape. The dominoes made by Festool have these little ridges that should hypothetically allow excess glue to escape as you fit them in, but man, they didn't want to seat in the mortises because I used way too much glue. After pounding the bejesus out of them, I eventually got it all together, definitely more in a huff than when I started. And what's more frustrating is that the dominoes in this case aren't necessary at all, it's just to help align the boards, but clamping calls will do the exact same thing for less time and effort, just with more clamps. There are many reasons why I choose to use a hand tool over a machine, and the simplest reason is when I don't own said machine, like a huge 25 horsepower wide belt sander, but my $40 1/16 horsepower 80-year-old Stanley Bailey also works, just way slower. I designed the desktop with an arc. Call me needy, call me whatever, but I wanted it to slightly hug me as I'm sitting in it. I'm not 100% sure what way would be the best to achieve this, so I opted to try two different ways since there are two separate tops on my desk. For the large main top, I decided to tackle it in a pretty basic way. I knew the radii of the inside, front, and back of the top from my drawing, so I wheeled my planer out into my driveway to use it as the pivot point for a hilariously long compass that I made. I'm not the biggest fan of the jigsaw, but there was no chance Mr. Twiggy Arms here is hoisting this top up on the bandsaw. The jigsaw blade, which was brand new, I might add, definitely deflected even though I was trying to take it slow. Needless to say, there was a lot of cleanup to do with the spoke shave to get this edge 90 degrees to the face. This is another situation where I'll reach for a hand tool when I need to clean up the mess left by a power tool. This was therefore quite a bit more effort than I expected, so I was looking forward to trying a different method on the smaller upper bridge monitor speaker stand thingy, but it would have to wait. I was excited that the main top was cut to its final shape, so I wanted to marry the top with the legs and worry about the smaller upper bridge monitor speaker stand thingy later. I figured that perhaps the best way to do this would be to turn this feature into a breadboard end that would be permanently fixed to the top instead of the legs. This desk is kinda large, so I'll need some way to knock the desk down to move it, so I was more or less hoping at this point that I'd eventually figure out how to screw the legs in a removable way into the breadboard ends. But for now, I pressed on with joining these to the top that would no doubt ruffle the feathers of the more romantic types in my audience. With the domino. This is a completely valid way to join the breadboard ends as long as wood movement is accounted for. You should never fully glue larger pieces of wood together if the grain directions are perpendicular to each other. Even though breadboard ends are perpendicular to the top, as long as the top is allowed to expand and contract in its depth without the breadboard end inhibiting it, it should be fine. The first step to this is to mortise the end of the top with the tight domino setting, and the breadboard end needs to have progressively wider mortises from the middle to the ends. I'll show you the rest of the method later on in the video, but right now I need to finish shaping these breadboard ends into what looks like Adirondack chair arms before I can finish this. This Adirondack chair arm shape allows the back leg to lap over the desktop in a way that I think looks pretty cool. To achieve this, I have to, well, create a lap joint. Or is this a dado? I think it's a dado. You tell me. I started by establishing the width of the dado with a 1/4 inch bit in my router and using my track attachment. Here's another reason why I sometimes reach for a hand tool as opposed to a power tool. When I don't want to make a huge mess. Chopping out the waste with a chisel just leaves chunks of wood below rather than the router just spitting dust all over my shop and into my lungs. This likely didn't take any longer by hand, but I did follow up with the router to get a flat-bottomed dado. As you can see, this is how it fits, which is far too tight at the moment, but I'm allowing myself some room to smooth plane and sand the breadboard. And the top goes there. A little chamfer makes the offset thickness of the top a nice transition. Here's where all the fuzzy bits of my plan are starting to become more obvious flaws in my plan. In my mind, this steel bracket that I'm making will be able to simultaneously be able to bolt underneath the breadboard and somehow slide into the dado in the back leg at the same time. With it recessed into the breadboard perfectly, I'm pretty proud of myself for figuring this out right about now, even though I totally don't have this figured out at all. Now finally starts the fun part. I really wanted to explore some bent laminations after totally getting inspired by Nick Padula's videos and somehow convincing myself that I could actually pull it off. I got into woodworking over 15 years ago, almost 20 years ago in high school because I had no friend. I mean because I wanted to make my own drums because I'm a drummer. So right from the start, I was attempting to figure out how to bend and form veneer into a perfect plywood cylinder. I had to learn all this through the School of Hard Knocks because there weren't any resources for how to make a drum shell in those days. And the first thing I learned was that even and plenty of clamping pressure is a must, and that cannot be achieved through regular old clamps. A vacuum press is far superior, though it's not completely foolproof. The biggest lesson for laminating that I learned through way too much trial and error was the type of glue to use. I wasted so much veneer using regular PVA wood glue back in the day. It's still painful to think about how much went in the garbage. When I found this glue, UltraCat resin, all of a sudden the clouds cleared, the veil lifted, and everything went way better. This glue dries pretty hard, so the laminations don't try to spring back at all. I've never had any issues with delaminations or bubbles or anything like that, which was a major struggle for me back in my drum shell building days. I've never tried doing an external bending form before. Everything I've done in the past was a form inside of the bag, which is definitely more precise. Clamping the whole bag with everything inside to an external form is faster, but in my case, I was definitely underestimating how accurate I actually needed things, but this is another case in which I'm obliviously punting a problem off for future Scott to figure out. I was feeling a little spicier than normal and wanted to throw in a different species into the otherwise all walnut desk. I've been pretty vocal in the past about not liking too much contrasting wood in furniture design. I think when not done correctly, it can draw way too much attention just to the simple fact that there are different woods rather than an overall form that's aesthetically pleasing. Like, I don't want to walk into a room that just screams maple and walnut from every single direction. What I did want to achieve with choosing a different species was some straight and bold high contrast grain that would follow the twist of the bent lamination. I went with Pau Ferro, but not by choice. My first choice was Cocobolo, but even though I had imported some in the past, this time I was denied. Something about CITES restrictions, I don't know. Pau Ferro, which is a type of rosewood I believe, definitely looks similar, but just not as intense as Cocobolo. Now, from seeing the 3D animations from all my SketchUp drawings so far, I'm sure you might be wondering, what's wrong with you? Well, to answer that, let me take you on a journey inside my brain. It all started on this piece of paper right here, and I sat down quite a while ago now and I drew a bunch of different desk designs, and it was this third one here that spoke to me the most. I then created a board on Milanote, the sponsor of today's video, by taking a photo of my sketch here and importing it into the app. Because it's cloud-based, the sketch is immediately available on my desktop Milanote app for me to expand my ideas on. And by expand my ideas on, I mean just brain vomit everything I have just onto the board. At least at the start. This may seem like a complete mess, but the brilliant thing that I like about Milanote is that I can organize my photos and notes and lists and links to products I need to buy and draw connections between them all with arrows just to make sense of it all. I particularly like organizing things into columns. After binge watching a whole bunch of Nick Padula's videos, I was inspired to try some bent laminations on the side of the desk in between the two legs. I had this idea that I wanted to combine the look of sails on a sailboat with some louvered vents I've seen on some cars. I had lots of thoughts and ideas for the bent laminations, and it all just got a little bit too messy. So when a component just becomes a little too much for the main board, I find it helpful to convert it all into a subboard, which is like turning a fresh new page on an extremely flexible sketchbook. Now, I'd be completely lying if I said that I didn't have any creative help when designing this desk. Sharing the board with friends allows me to convey all of my ideas at once, and people can leave comments telling me what they like and what they don't like, or what they're completely confused about. Milanote is available for free with no time limit, so check out the link in the description where you can sign up for your account. Thanks to Milanote for sponsoring this video. It was at this point that I had a brilliant idea for the edge profile on the legs, so I finally got my act together. And it all starts with this huge but suspiciously inexpensive 1.5 inch radius roundover bit. By lowering the bit more than it's typically set up and flipping the part over on both sides, I've achieved what's called a thumbnail profile. This to me is a wonderful look because it softens and makes the edge look less chunky while still retaining a sharp corner. Simply throwing a regular roundover on all edges can make things look a little blobby and undefined. This is the best of both worlds. And this big honkin' bit, although it sounds a little scary, it was fine in the end. Until it wasn't. Dismayed at the slip-up that happened at the very last edge, and also annoyed that I didn't catch it on camera, I moved on to something more relaxing and less accident-prone. The angle grinder. One of the more exciting things I like in furniture design is taking something that's flat and two-dimensional and turning it into something more interesting. Modern furniture that's constructed with pattern routing tends to fall into this a little too often, and I'm always looking to make my designs look a little less flat-packed. Now, carving is a great way to achieve more three-dimensional stuff, but it can also quickly turn into something way over the top. I like dramatic design, but there's a fine line between eye-catching and way too on the nose, which I unfortunately see a lot of. Look, there's nothing wrong with carving your pet dog into your media console, but Nugget hasn't proved to me that he should be immortalized into my living room furniture. What I'm looking for is to play with light and shadow. You can create hard lines that complement structural parts of the design, you can create gradual shadows for a softer appearance, and you can create cavities and hollows that achieve both at the same time. And carving with hand tools or power tools means you don't have to be beholden to your collection of router bits. All I'm doing is drawing a line and slowly relieving the material next to it. The cut-saw disc on the angle grinder makes quick work of removing the bulk of the material, but there's just no way to create a smooth and fair contour with it, so some spoke shaving and scraping later, I achieved what I was after. A while back, I filled a void in this piece with black epoxy. I could tell the grain around it was some of the more interesting stuff out of the whole tree, so after it was resawn and milled straight, it looked pretty snazzy. In an effort to make the legs less flat again, these parts would bolster the look of the feet to make them look fuller, I guess. For some reason, and I'm not sure why, but I really wanted to call these feet cheeks. To make my feet cheeks less square, I put a pretty heavy chamfer along the top edge. It was crucial that these lined up perfectly once glued in place, so I needed a way to align them to an exact spot. And by golly gee whiz, I wish I hadn't just used the domino there. Or even there. Without knowing it, I just cost myself at least 12 hours of work. Yet, in the spirit of trying not to make my life harder in the future, I was careful not to apply glue too close to the edge where it would squeeze out. I finish sand little areas like these before gluing things together because it's so much harder to do it after, and I don't want a little squeeze out ruining that. Even with the chamfer, my feet cheeks were still looking a little fat, so I rough sketched a line and rounded off the toes, front and back. They still look too blocky, so I wanted to taper the width towards the front and back toes. Oh God. Yep, that's the domino that I used for alignment. Well, there was nothing more to do than to just lean right into it, because I still really liked where this was going, but I instantly knew what it was going to take to fix this blunder. And it wasn't gonna be pretty. I mean, it was gonna be pretty, but it wasn't gonna be fun. Or quick. Here's an example of a third reason why I'll grab a hand tool over a power tool. When the hand tool can do the job better, plain and simple. After blending in the thumbnail profile to my feet cheeks with the cut-saw disc, the best choice to smooth out this curve the way I want it to be is a spoke shave. Any sort of power sander would just knock the sharp corners off the thumbnail and chamfer, and this wouldn't guarantee a fair curve anyways. And as a fair warning, you're gonna see a lot of spoke shaving in this video. Time to repair the exposed domino, and along with it, my dignity. I bought this brass square rod to inlay somewhere else on the desk, which you'll see later, so it only seemed fitting to inlay it here too. Routing out the slot over the domino was easy enough with a router fence, and I love that this rather cheap DeWalt one has a micro adjust which made nailing the fit every time actually pretty easy. What was a pain in the gluteus region was pillowing and polishing each brass inlay to 600 grit. My fingies were in so much pain after this, but the final effect was really nice. It almost looks like I meant to do this. This is me realizing that there was a flaw in my plan for attaching the steel plate to the breadboard end. So I did what any experienced woodworker does, and pretend like I didn't notice it and go do something else. There was little left that was easy to do, so it was time to shape the bent laminations to fit in the gap between the legs. I had absolutely zero clue how to proceed here, so I just started nibbling away at them until I thought they kinda looked good. The real tricky part was to shape the joint for where the laminations meet the bottom corner between the legs. There was no grand plan here for an intricate joint, it was just gonna be more or less a butt joint. But the way I look at it, the severe angle that I shaped into the end there made it kind of look more like a miter, and as I've proven in another video, miters are actually quite strong. However, this is where using the less precise external bending form started to rear its ugly head. The laminations weren't flat. I mean, I know they're twisted and all, but they're also cupped along the width, which is giving me a heck of a hard time trying to make a tight joint. In hindsight, it was always going to be this way since wood does not like to bend in two different directions at the same time, but I still didn't really expect this. To make matters worse, holding these friggin' things in my vise was a real test of my patience. Obviously, there's no parallel surfaces for the vise to grab onto, and while I could just squeeze it to death and hope for the best, it would also temporarily deform the lamination, causing me to just fly blind while shaping it. Eventually, I came to a somewhat satisfactory result, but not fully convinced the joint at the bottom was going to look any good in the end. Cutting the tops of the bent lamination to sit under the steel bracket was annoyingly time consuming. With a plane iron, I marked the line all the way around the lamination so I could keep an eye on my progress from both sides while I slowly cut it with my Ryoba. It was then just a matter of planing down to the line with my block plane. These bent laminations have zero flat or straight faces, edges, or ends, so there's no way to put this on a table saw or a bandsaw or miter saw or any powered handsaw that I could think of. This is a fourth reason why I'll grab a hand tool first when there's no power tool that can do the job at all. Even though I just got the laminations screwed to the bracket above, I immediately took them apart again to do some finish prep, and by some, I mean days of my life scraping and sanding the laminations and legs by hand while dealing with more insolence from my vise. A little while ago, I had taken the time to glue up the smaller upper bridge monitor speaker stand thingy and fill a few voids with black epoxy. Having nightmare flashbacks from the jigsaw on the main desktop, I switched it up for a new plan to cut out the final shape. I was just barely able to summon the strength required to cut this out on the bandsaw, but it was much faster, smoother, and more accurate. And even better, the top was narrow enough to send through my planer to clean up the glue joints and the rest of the epoxy. Instead of drawing the arc shape with my world's largest compass, I did something quite possibly even more comical and made a giant paper template out of 22 sheets of printer paper and cut it out on a 1/4 inch piece of MDF. Joking aside, pattern routing the whole top turned out wonderfully accurate in the end, and I didn't have to bust my little twiggy arms with the spoke shave again. For the sake of continuity, I repeated the thumbnail profile from the legs on the edges of both desktops. I'm not entirely convinced this huge and suspiciously inexpensive router bit is safe to use in a handheld router, but since I wasn't using the entire cutting edge all at the same time, it felt pretty manageable. I'm gonna make a bit of a bold move here that I hummed and hawed about since pretty much the beginning. I designed a curved relief to the front edge of the desk for a nice place for my wrists to land while typing. I was confident that it would feel good to use, but not really confident that it would look any good. Occasionally when I looked at what I had drawn, it kinda gave the top the appearance that it was sagging, when it obviously was not sagging. But as you can see, I just went for it. You only YOLO once. I made the same curved relief in the upper top bridge monitor stand thingy for no practical reason, just to match the main top. Also, the power plane is a really great tool. I use it so much for removing bulk material in odd settings. It does, however, have its limitations, especially in this case where I'm more or less carving a concavity, and I'm quickly reaching the limits of what it'll do. Time to prep the breadboard ends for assembly, and they were looking a little Chonkosaurus Rex at the moment, so I drew some lines and hacked away at them until I liked it, which seems to be the general theme of this whole build, in case you didn't realize. I'm not sure why, but I was feeling a little nervous about finally assembling these breadboard ends. And that's because I haven't done a whole lot of these in the past, because that traditional breadboard look isn't something that I'm usually after. The dominoes were all glued into the ends of the desk that had the tight mortise. Now, like I said before, I can't glue the breadboard along its entire length because of wood movement, but I still needed a way to secure the breadboard to the top, which I did by draw boring dowels through the breadboard, through the dominoes, and back through the breadboard again. There's a few things to keep in mind when doing this. First, to actually draw bore and not just bore, you need to offset the holes in the dominoes towards the edge of the desktop for the dowel to pull the breadboard towards the top as it's being driven in. Second, the holes in the outer dominoes need to be made into slots so that the dowels can traverse back and forth in the slot as the top expands and contracts with seasonal wood movement. Third, don't break a domino doing this. Fourth, when assembling, only put glue in the center and on the center dominoes to make sure the top can still move uninhibited elsewhere. And fifth, add a little bit of glue just to the top third of the dowel so it doesn't back out, which I honestly don't think it would anyways, particularly in my case because of the next thing I'm gonna do. Since my fingers didn't hurt enough from the first brass inlay, I got to work pillowing and polishing these little brass plugs to hide the simple looking dowels from the breadboard ends. Now, I know I totally glazed over all the finer details of the breadboard operation, but lucky for you, I have an entire video dedicated to showing you everything, and I just sent that out in my video email newsletter. I'll leave a link down below if you're interested in seeing that. Plus, every couple of weeks I send out a new video, and they're full of helpful woodworking lessons that are far too detailed for YouTube. I thought about starting a Patreon for this type of thing, but honestly, I'm just scared of commitment, so I figured this is a free way for you to enjoy more content from me. After much searching, I finally found these leveling feet that would be substantial enough and low enough to fit within the bottom of the legs, and since those are long and flat, and my floors are anything but, the desk definitely needed leveling feet. Countersinking these into the legs where they'll be hidden was truly frightening, as I could very easily drill right out of the top of the foot and ruin an incredible amount of work up until this point. After that stress-inducing endeavor, I moved on to fixing a past mistake, trimming down the chewed up top of the legs from the slip up with the thumbnail profile. If I had the foresight to cut the edge profile before the legs were cut to length, I would have avoided this slip up entirely. At this point, I'm not sure if my computer would actually fit underneath the upper top anymore, so I busied myself with something a little more peaceful, applying finish to the legs. Osmopolix is my hard wax oil of choice, and I was very pleased with how much color the walnut had. The best way to finish something on all sides at the same time is to hang it up, and I conveniently had these little 4-inch hooks to thread into the screw holes that were already created by mounting them. I also accidentally filmed this in slow motion, so enjoy the added dramaticism. Before I can put finish on the tops, I had to actually finish making the tops, notably cutting the upper top monitor bridge speaker stand thingy to length and figuring out how I was going to mount it. I was a little concerned up to now that there wasn't any structural element that would prevent the entire desk from racking back and forth. I mean, I wasn't about to stick a barn door X brace across the whole back, so I opted to make these steel brackets out of 1/4-inch plate, hoping that they would be enough to stiffen everything up. After a meteoric amount of finish prep, I could finally put the finish on the tops. I don't normally do this, but I have all of this finishing footage, and because I'm not emotionally equipped enough to deal with awkward silences, I wanted to take a moment to thank you for making it this far in my longest video to date. If you've seen my other videos, you know that I don't typically do these high-end furniture builds very often, and while I probably have had the most fun making it over any of my other videos thus far, this isn't necessarily signaling a shift in my content direction. I just need a personal project every once in a while to keep things motivated. But if you like seeing this type of video more than what I normally produce, then let me know. If you are new to the channel and you like what you see and you want to see more of it, it would mean a bunch to me if you would like and subscribe. That just lets YouTube know that I strive to make the highest quality content so they can recommend it to the most people. Thinking that I was in the home stretch, I attached the leveling feet without ruining anything. I popped the spiffy looking brackets onto the legs, and I could finally permanently glue in the bent laminations. I'm not gonna lie to you, the glue joint at the bottom was less than perfect. I kind of suspected this was gonna happen, but what are you gonna do? Contemplating putting a huge ugly bow tie over the whole thing, I eventually came to my senses and just slapped a bunch of wood filler over it and called it a day. This is certainly my biggest build to date. Maybe not physically big, but big in terms of detail and design. And I couldn't be more proud of how it turned out. I mean, except for the mess of cables down there. Just ignore that, I'll clean that up later. Good news, my computer does fit underneath the upper top. Dodged a bullet there. The only nagging thing that I didn't nail is the racking strength. If I push it, it does rack just a tiny bit, not gonna lie. I think there's a couple of options to fix this, but I'm not sure what the best move is right now, so I'm just gonna think on it for a while. But all in all, I am super happy with how this turned out, and I'm excited to explore designing more high-end furniture, maybe a slightly more regular basis.